IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti. It's been a while since you've probably heard my voice on All Things Policy. I used to be Associate Fellow here at Takshashila, and I'm now an independent historian and researcher. I'm joined today by my good friend Rajat Ubhaykar. Rajat is a journalist and an author of one of the most fascinating books that I've happened to come across in recent months. It's called Truck Day India, which let me first begin by complimenting you on that brilliant little name, Rajat. And of course, Truck Day India also has a beautiful title inspired by the unique truck decor of the Indian subcontinent. Truck Day India is one of the most fascinating books that I've read recently, as I've said, because it's a story of India that's told from the perspective of India's highways. It's told from the perspective of India's truckers. Really, in a lot of ways, the arteries, the guys who really make India's economy function on a day-to-day level by moving goods from one place to another. Truck drivers are not necessarily the most glamorous occupation in India. We're much more used to stories that come from India's cities, especially if you happen to watch Netflix. You're probably endlessly exposed to a deluge of content about the travails of millennials in Indian cities. But something about this unique perspective about India, to me at least, felt so much more authentic. Those who've been listening to All Things Policy for a while will probably know that I'm a massive history nerd, and Truck Day India is a book that is not only a historical record of the experiences of truckers in 21st century India, but it's also a book that is full of history because it really makes you think about the way that Indian societies have evolved. It makes you think a lot about the way that the vast majority of Indians have lived and continue to live, and the kind of institutions, the kind of policy foibles that they're exposed to. As Rajat puts it in a conversation that we had slightly earlier, the petty daily tyranny of the bureaucrats. In addition to that, it's also just genuinely a very beautiful book. It's a book that talks about Rajat's experiences hitchhiking with truckers across the length and breadth of India, and it is absolutely suffused with a very profound love for India's people and its landscapes that I found deeply moving. So without any further ado, let me welcome you, Rajat. Thank you so much for joining me on All Things Policy today. And let's begin by talking about Truck Day India.
Thanks, Anirudh, for such a generous introduction. And I'm delighted you enjoyed the book. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm a regular listener, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here.
It's absolutely our pleasure, and I'm sure that our listeners will agree after our conversation. So let me begin, Rajat, by actually talking a little bit about the men themselves, the individuals who are really at the heart of your book. There's just so many fascinating characters that you happen to meet in your travels. I won't get into them in any level of detail, of course, since I really want folks who are listening to go and buy the book. But the very first trucker that you travel with is a gentleman called Shyam, who is from I believe, Uttarakhand or Himachal Pradesh?
Yeah, Himachal, yeah.
Himachal. And the reason I found your description of him so interesting was because you describe him as a regal man, Regal is a term that is so rarely associated with truckers that the usage of that term was immediately very striking to me. And I had also happened to be, I just so happened to have come across some examples of Pahadi art just a few hours before I happened to come across that description. And I saw some beautiful examples of these mountain kings with these flowing mustaches and hooked noses. And when you described Shyam as also having a hooked nose, it's just like really hit me that this could very well be a face that you see in any elite Indian court painting, right? Which is just something that I from a nerdy perspective was interesting, because the faces that you see on any Indian painting or sculpture are ostensibly those of India's rulers, but are also very much just Indian faces, right? I'm sure anybody who's seen me recently would be able to attest that I have begun to cultivate a Hoysala man bun and mustache myself. But tell us a little bit about Shyam, and tell us a little bit about what it was like for you, as a city dweller. What is it like for you to first interact with these gentlemen, and what is it like for you to see them as distinct individuals with their own rich history and heritage and their old worldview? What is that like?
So to begin with, Sham, right? Like this regal air is something that is linked to both the construction of the truck as well as their self-perception of themselves. I mean, I'm not saying that all truckers have a regal air, but one of the most common phrases that you will see on a truck is that of a road king. Okay, so most of the trucks will have a road king written on it, and it's almost as if the truck is supreme in the hierarchy of the highways. They are the ones who are really reigning over the highways. It is their domain, and others are just passerbys. Whereas it is the trucks who actually live there and who rule over that domain. So in that sense, I felt that Sham being regal was also fitting. And even the truck's architecture, like the truck art has been elevated to like an crazy level in Pakistan. And there's a very interesting paper from Pakistan that I read on the construction of the truck, how it is built like a Mughal throne, and it sort of reflects the architecture of the Mughal palace at that time. And I felt the comparison was appropriate for the Pakistani trucks that I saw on the internet. But at the same time, that can also be seen in many Indian trucks. The sort of tassels that hang from the sides, the mirror work, all of that evokes a sort of courtly background. And interestingly, like for the geek in you, most of the Pakistani truck art was done by craftsmen and artisans from former royal houses of, say, Gujarat, Rajasthan, who found themselves out of work after partition and then lent their their skills to the burgeoning truck industry. So all of this is linked in many. Yeah. So apart from that, of course, my own personal experience, it was a great learning experience. That is the first thing I would say, because we live such constricted lives, right? I mean, though we have the world at our fingertips, we have the world's information at our fingertips, but that information is itself constructed by an elite in various ways for the consumption of other elites. But there are so many different ways of living and being in India, and we do not get a sense of that at all. I mean, the vast majority of Indians are, especially the privileged Indians, because of the various issues of caste hierarchy and so on, they're terrible with manual labor. Like you look at any privileged Indian, he won't know to do anything with his hands. It's because we have outsourced all our work to the underclass, and so because of that, we do not really know what it means and what it's like to live like an ordinary Indian. I mean, and our perspectives are so constrained that it gets frankly boring. I mean, when I often when I interact with, say, my fellows from my same socio-economic background, often after a point the conversation becomes like, what's the latest Netflix show you watched? That's like, after that there's no point. I mean, what kind of conversation, what can you really learn about life, from someone from the same socio-economic background? But when you interact with a class that's different from yours, when you talk to them honestly, you ask them about their issues, about their life, what their childhood was like, you learn so much about India, and you learn how useless you are. When I was traveling in the truck, I felt like profoundly useless. I mean, though I'm supposedly academically I have done well in life and so on, but what do I really know? I mean, I'm just a bookworm. I mean, I don't really know anything to do with my hands. If a truck breaks down or if my car breaks down, I probably wouldn't know how to do anything. And that sort of makes you realize that there are various kinds of intelligences in India, and intelligence is not necessarily academic intelligence. There are so many people who you meet who you can tell are exceptionally bright, and given the right opportunities, they would have become something else in life. And that sense of wonder and that sense of what if really fascinates me. And this trip was in a way meant to explore that other India which we never encounter, or we choose to never encounter.
There's so many fascinating points and potential tangents that we can go off of. But I will indulge the history geek in myself, and let's talk a little bit about the truck art, right? The fact that I had no idea that it was artists who were employed by former courtly houses that happened to do this, because I was kind of wondering, like, what are the precise mechanisms of like a Mughal court aesthetic being transported to a truck
Yeah.
context. Another thing that that this actually leads me to is the fact that there's so much cultural difference also within these truckers, and also in terms of the aesthetics, of course, but also just in terms of the way they see the world as a result of the various backgrounds across India that they happen to come from. So as you were traveling through India, like you talk a lot about Punjabi truck drivers, for example. In fact, I think a couple of my favorite characters from the book were the brothers Jora and Jagdev, and like, what absolutely fascinating gentlemen, like.
Yeah.
But more generally, can you tell me, can you give us a sense perhaps of like culturally and aesthetically, like how do truckers approach to their professions vary across the subcontinent?
Of course, I mean, as a caveat, like whatever I say will be a kind of a generalization. So with that caveat, let me just get into what my broad observations were. So I felt like in North India, often like the truckers look at it as a lifestyle. It's something that they will have these amazing stereo speakers. They will like properly deck up their truck extravagantly, invest more in it. Like the Kashmiri truckers, for example, invested double the amount of ordinary truckers in decking up their trucks. And similarly, another trucker crew I met from Gwalior, they had like, it was one of the most uh, luxurious and plush trucks that I ever traveled in. So in that sense, they look at trucking as this lifestyle where they're driving around, having fun in between, and many of them seem quite satisfied with their lives, at least on the face of it. But in South India, I felt that it's more of a livelihood. It's not a lifestyle. They're doing it out of compulsion because there's no other opportunities. But of course, this might be the case in North India also, that they're doing it out of no other opportunities. But in South India, there's this awareness that there's a better world out there. The trucking is not the best job in the world, and maybe I should look out and find something else. So one of the truckers I traveled with, he was using trucking as driving practice to become a bus driver in the state government transport service. So that is how their approach is. They are always looking out to improve their life, because trucking pays peanuts. It poses constant threat to your life. It is not the most respectable job. There is also often harassment and extortion on the roads. So obviously they do want to look out for better opportunities. In the Northeast, I felt that trucking was a very, very new profession. Most of the truckers were young. Like many of them were teenagers, like barely in their 20s, because I think roads and all, the economy as such is relatively backward, right? In that sense, even trucking as a profession is very new for the locals over there. Whereas in Punjab and so on, it is older. So the history of trucking is important to understand, like how these regional variations have developed. So firstly, the first thing to remember is that the first trucks that came in India were military trucks. Like First World War, Second World War, that was when trucks started coming into India in a real sense. And as a consequence, the drivers were also military drivers, of course, because they were the ones who first learned how to drive a truck, carry around supplies across the globe, across India. In the Northeast, there was the front where the Japanese were there. So because of the domination of the Punjabis in the military establishment of the British, that is why, I mean, it's a hypothesis. Nobody has done any study on this. Because of that, the Punjabi domination of truckers that we see, our perception of truckers as Punjabis or Sikhs, that is where it comes from. It's my feeling. I didn't go into that in the book because it is speculation, but I have a distinct feeling that it has something to do with why Punjabis are considered the original truckers. And even in Nagaland, when I went, no, so there's this huge cemetery dedicated to the soldiers who died in the Battle of Kohima. And over there, the names that I saw were that of all were that of Punjabi Muslims. Like now in Pakistan, of course, but many of them had the prefix driver attached to it. So they were clearly truck drivers at that time. So all this led me to that conclusion. So yeah, just a tangent.
That's an interesting point, actually. That was a moment that like really stuck with me in the book is two things really. First of all, let me just highly recommend to all of our listeners to please read up on the Battle of Kohima, the Stalingrad of the East, as it's called. Rajat, are there any books that you would recommend that our listeners check out to understand more about the topic?
No, none. As I mean, not. I don't know a definitive book. I read sources here and there. I didn't read a definitive book. So I would suggest the readers look out for. Just read. The best website is to go. So the Britishers have done a great job at preserving all the battles they've fought in. I found a great website in which they've documented all the battles they were involved in during the Second World War, and the description of the Battle of Kohima was brilliant. Like, they've done a great job of documenting it. The contribution of the soldiers, both Indian as well as Britishers, during the Second World War. So I would recommend listeners go check that out.
What really struck me was when I think you mentioned that you came across a gravestone of a 25-year-old driver, and that really hit me because that guy was a year younger than I am, and he died, and this ideal of giving up your life for something, and to think how different and like how much suffering there would have been if the Japanese got into India, and permit me to like politely disagree with Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose on this subject. It is really something to think about. That the truck drivers again are so integral to the history of India, right? But they're very much the unsung heroes. They're the unsung heroes of wars. They're the unsung heroes of the day-to-day operation of our economy. Another thing that like I really enjoyed was this little detail you mentioned about how apparently you must have some kind of social message on your truck. Is that like a government regulation or something? Because when I was moving from Bangalore to Hyderabad recently, I saw so many trucks with Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, and I was like, oh wow, hey, that's really cool, man. Truckers are absolutely like going all in on getting their daughters educated, which is amazing. And then later when I read that, I was like, damn it.
I mean, it is like free advertising for the government, right? If you get truckers to do this.
And the Sunday ho ya Monday, Roj ka Monday. Like, I'd never thought of trucks as these moving advertisements that reflect so many tiny little fragments of our society, and yet have somehow never been like systematically considered. That was so fascinating to me. But
I mean, that is exactly what Sorry, that is exactly what prompted me to write this. It's like we have invisibilized them to an extent that is just staggering. Like 70 years after independence, I don't think there is any detailed study of what is happening on our highways. I couldn't come across anything. I actually wanted to read something on this, and I couldn't come across anything. Like, what is happening on our highways? That is where the cost of logistics comes in. That is where the conduct of the economy happens in reality. But there is nothing. I was so staggered, and that is what prompted me. When I have to figure this out for myself, if not for anything else. And when I set out on the journey, it's not like I had any book deal or anything like that. I was 23 then, and I just wanted to have an adventure. I wanted a story to tell my grandchildren, basically. So I thought I'll just probably try my hand at this.
You've written a story that really told not just to your grandchildren, but hopefully to many people's grandchildren in the years to come. But coming back to this idea of the cost of logistics is something that I found very fascinating, right? One thing I really enjoyed about the book is the fact that you take the time in between your travels to really set the context for the reader by diving into the history, which we've touched upon a little earlier, but more importantly, diving into the policy and the bureaucracy and just the sheer universalized corruption that kind of keeps the Indian system going. From the fact that truckers have to overload because that's the only way that they can make substantial profits, and that there's this entire system that is set up in order to make sure that they don't have to necessarily pay tolls. But what really struck me was your section, I think, when you were in Jodhpur, I believe, where you talk about information asymmetry. That's something that that's very, very interesting from a public policy perspective, right? And any of our listeners who have taken Takshila's courses would also probably have come across that term, information asymmetry. But this is such a magnificent and honestly somewhat harrowing example of it, because it shows you that what is very, very clearly a suboptimal system that is only able to function because drivers have access to much less information than the guys who have the social capital and the connections to actually know the prices and manage to fix things and have the contacts and all that. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How is it that information asymmetry affects drivers?
So the structure of the transportation industry is, I won't say it's a uniform structure. Local factors often bring their own local peculiarities to the structure, but the broad structure is such that there's the consignor who wants to send his goods across the country. There's the driver often there's a owner operator, what they call it in industry parlance, as owner operator, who owns the truck he drives in. And often there are drivers who work for a Seth, as they call them. And these two guys are represented by two distinct sets of intermediaries. So one is the commission agent who represents the drivers, and there's the booking agent who represents the consignors. And these two guys then interact. It's not like there's only one intermediary. There are two intermediaries in between. And the booking agents have more of a say because they're in direct touch with the consignor, and they can then fix the prices accordingly after talking to the consignor. So basically the consignor hires one booking agent who then contacts a commission agent, and then the commission agent will approach a trucker. If you please come here, this guy needs his goods picked up. Now the trucker will never really know what has been decided because there are two layers right in between. He never really knows what the actual price is, what he is getting paid. So as a result, these intermediaries corner a disproportionate share of the proceeds. Like estimates range from 30 to 40%, which for basically just connecting the people. They are not, I mean, it's estimates, and these estimates will, of course, vary across the country. I mean, the structure is different everywhere. In some cases, there won't be two intermediaries. There'll only be one intermediary. And as a result, there is an immense level of cartelization, especially among the booking agents. So they will demarcate territory. Okay, this is our territory. You don't come here, and there will be price fixing arrangements. So all kinds of cartelization happens at the level of the booking agents, because of which the price is opaquely decided upon. The truckers do not really know what is the actual price, what is the fair price they need to pay. Often in times of greater demand, say during Diwali, when everyone is buying stuff and everyone is sending out stuff, when the price should rise commensurately, that increase in the price is not passed on to the trucker, not to the level it should be. So all these factors mean that truck drivers are the victims of a structural violence. It's a systematic structural violence, which reduces their incomes, keeps them in penury, keeps them bonded to their owner often, because the owner often he needs to. Often the commission agents will hold back some money from the trucker, saying I'll give it to you later, as a way of binding him to the. So all these factors happen. I won't go into a lot of detail, but this is the broad structure of the industry, and this also leads to the question, right? This is clearly a case of market failure, right? I mean, in which case there's so much cartelization happening. It's a case where free markets, like without any government intervention, is not exactly working as it should, and it's being exploited by a handful of people. So in this case, the question arises, like, I mean, I don't have an answer to this. Maybe the Takshashila folks, you guys might know better, and if you guys do this. But what should be the level of state interference? Like, how should the state intervene? Is state interference justified in such a case? How should this work out? I mean, this is such an important part of the economy, but I don't think a lot of work has been done on this, because it is a very unorganized, fragmented industry. No one really knows what's happening on the ground unless you are part of that ecosystem. Because of all these factors, it's not studied. And if it's not studied, then of course, then nothing can be done. How can policy be framed if we don't even understand what's happening on the ground? So, I mean, just an observation I thought would be interesting.
No, it's a fascinating and like a enormously complex policy problem. Which, I mean, I'm not even going to pretend that I have any ideas on how this can be solved. And hopefully, if Anupam is listening to this, then perhaps he can make this an assignment for future Takshila students. But on the subject of like state interference, right? What really just struck me the most about about your book and the interactions you had with drivers is how little they expect from the state and how little the state cares for them. I think you mentioned that Andhra Pradesh is literally the only state that has laybys where drivers can just stop for the night, cook, use the
Yeah.
restroom, hang out, chat, whatever. That is so absolutely heartbreaking to think about. That there is literally one state that bothers to think about these individuals as human beings. And
Yeah.
there's so many examples that you keep providing of various arbitrary policy decisions that make zero sense and evidently were not made in consultation with drivers who are actually going around. Like, for example, making it compulsory to have AC cabins, which was pointed out, which a truck driver pointed out to you, was not going to work because they would rather keep the AC off and pocket the savings because that's more important to
Yeah.
them. And the massive logistics companies are not going to allow their drivers to keep the AC on in any case because it's going to affect their mileage. And just shows you what a massive disconnect there is from the people who are making the policy and the people who are most affected by it. And it is really harrowing to read, not just of the way that these folks are constantly kind of trod down by the system, but also the fact that somehow they're okay with it. And that is honestly almost as disturbing as the nonchalance of the system itself.
Yeah, in the sense, if you look at it historically, Indian rulers across history, they have paid so much attention to the maintenance of proper facilities on the highways. Like Sher Shah Suri, as I write in the book also, he built sarais where travelers were afforded food and accommodation at the expense of the state. At least that's what the
And
medieval chroniclers claim. I don't know how much.
I mean, yeah,
and
there's Sher Shah, but also even beyond that, you have
beyond that, yeah.
Mughal rulers for whom it's a matter of prestige to build a sarai where where these merchants can come and hang out. I mean, that's
And these sarais were often the nuclei of urbanization, right? This is
correct.
They became like market towns, they became kasbas, and after that they became cities, many of them like Mughal Sarai, Begusarai, and so on. But now there has been indifference, and because truckers do not constitute a distinct political constituency, it's not like they're not relatively less well organized. So the organization that represents truckers, the AIMTC, All India Motor Transport Congress, that is an organization of truck owners. It is not an organization of truckers, like truck drivers. And the truck owners often pass off the interests of the truckers, of their own interests, as that of the truck drivers, whereas often their interests may be diametrically opposite. But at the level of the truck drivers, there is no organization, because of which there is no point of wooing these people, right? In the sense of a class-based wooing. Often the wooing will happen at the community level. Like this guy belongs to a particular, say he belongs to the Kapu caste in Andhra Pradesh. Then depending on local factors and how his community is voting, how his family is voting, he will cast his vote accordingly. So where is the incentive for the political class to do anything at all for this on this? There is no incentive as such, which is why this issue has been on the back burner forever. And honestly, I don't see it this changing a lot in the near future, at least.
I feel like this is something that, I mean, it's been happening for decades, but I feel like the pandemic has made it all the more visible that very often, if there is no political utility, the Indian state isn't necessarily going to do a lot, and it's just going to expect the most poor and marginalized citizens to just get by and leave them upon the mercies of society, right? And while it has been heartening to see during the pandemic, to see people across the social spectrum really mobilizing to try and just get through this as a society, it is kind of sad to see that there has not been that level of awareness necessarily for the people who really keep our economies going. Which, of course, leads me to my next question. How has the pandemic affected Indian trucking? The initial lockdown in India was among the strictest in the world. Very little, if any, transportation was happening, very often with little to no good reason at all. But how did this affect truckers? I can imagine that it must have had an enormous economic impact to not be able to drive and make an income. And did it profoundly change the way the kind of balance between the owners of truckers and the operators of these trucks? Did it end up driving people into debt? How has it really changed the logistics market in India? Because towards the ending of your book, you already highlight that these massive logistics firms that employ truckers as employees rather than having truckers being basically entrepreneurs who work with these like dalals and so on. There's already this change that was happening. Has that been accelerated as a result of the pandemic, or like how really does the what is the situation now?
See, there are not a lot of studies which are tracking this change in the first place. So it is very difficult to say or give any sort of quantitative assessment of what the changes have been exactly, and whether there have been any structural changes, which I doubt. In India, things somehow have a way of reverting back to the normal after a period of shock. Say, for example, with truckers, when the first lockdown was announced, like, because their movement was restricted, there were stories of truckers abandoning their truck, parking it somewhere, and just going to their villages. And for a while, the balance between the owners and the drivers was tilted in favor of the drivers, because there was shortage of drivers. People had gone back to their homes, and the owners were desperately seeking for someone who could drive the trucks, whatever minimal amount of traffic that was going on. So there was, for some period of time, there was a serious driver shortage there. But I don't think at this moment, I think things have reverted back to how they were. But talking about, like, I don't think the pandemic has had a profound influence on trucking as such. But there are broad changes that are happening in the industry. So, like, one phenomenon is that of containerization. So most of the trucks that we see in India are these flat top trucks which are built in the workshop by hand. And they are wooden. The compartment is wooden where the stuff is loaded. But that is increasingly giving way to containers, which are built according to standard specifications, and the goods also that are carried inside are often specialized. So, for example, there are a lot of car carriers in India, like trucks which are only designed to carry cars, like around there are 15,000-20,000 car carriers. And there is this trend towards greater formalization of the industry, especially in South India, from what I experience. Again, this topic is not studied at all, so it is so difficult to back up anything with any quantitative study and with a systematic study. So, but in my anecdotal experience, it is the formalization is happening more in South India. And apart from that, another trend is that of startups. So there are startups like Revigo, Blackbuck, which are trying to remove the intermediaries by connecting them directly via their platform. It's like an Uber, right? I mean, it seems like the simplest thing to do, right? Where you just connect a consignor with a trucker, and man, your job is done, and you pocket a commission from both of them. Seems like a good business model, right? But these startups have struggled a lot in India because the intermediaries, they have really resisted the entry of these startups. They often violently. Like one of the startup guys I talked to, who was running this company in Visakhapatnam, he had his office vandalized by the intermediaries. The stuff was broken, the goals attacked him. Yeah, so basically, any such structural change is going to meet with resistance. Like, India is a status quoist country, as we know. Like, status quo goes on, and any big change is encountered with stiff resistance. So yeah, these are the broad changes that are happening in the industry. But the pandemic, I would say, is not been a major catalyst of these changes as such. These were already
That's honestly
happening.
a little surprising. But yeah, I mean, your points about the status quo itself fundamentally not being affected are interesting. One interesting thing that you did point out was that less and less people are inclined to be truckers, and there's actually a significant demand for truckers. It remains to be seen, perhaps, if this demand for truckers is actually going to translate into better wages for them, for example. That's what one would expect in a free market situation. But as we've already discussed, this doesn't necessarily. There are clear cases of market failure. So I'd be curious to see really how that develops. You pointed out that truckers used to be considered equivalent to, like, or treated with the same kind of respect as doctors, like back in the 80s, because they were the sole lifeline for a lot of villages, right? Because they would travel through. And it is very interesting to think about, like, the kind of historical trajectory, the kind of experiences that these guys would have had, because I'm sure there are drivers who started driving in the 80s who are still driving now. And I'd be very curious to, like, actually see what they think.
Yeah, so one of the guys I traveled with, he was driving trucks since the 60s. In Odisha. And
60s.
He was a veteran trucker. He was very, very old, and he had stopped driving trucks when I met him. But I was talking to him about his experiences, like how were the roads back then. Like, what level of highway robbery did you experience? Was the safety aspect bad during those times? And his answers were very revealing. So one thing that came out was that he was he had a great opinion of the Sikhs. Okay, he said when often we used to get robbed by robbers and stuff on the road, and at that time the only people who would stop and like battle the drivers or try to battle the robbers would be the Sardar
Hmm.
drivers. So he had a lot of
Hmm.
respect for the Sardars. That, these guys will stand up for you, even if there is nothing for it in them. So in it for them. So that was an interesting experience. But broadly, like the boom phase was for trucking was in the 80s in India. That was when commercial vehicle production in India also started. The auto policy was liberalized, and commercial vehicle production started in India. So there was a huge boom then, basically. After that, the one big change which led to the difference in perception of truckers is the advent of the power steering, because the power steering
Hmm.
made driving so easy that anyone could do it. Like earlier, driving trucks was like driving a forklift or operating a crane, a relatively specialized job which is paid accordingly. But power steering made things so easy that the value of the truck drivers were devalued in the market, and as a result, over time, they also lost their respect and their status, which they enjoyed in the 80s and so on. So that's the broad trajectory of what these guys have experienced. Another thing is, of course, the wage stagnation. That is immense, because inflation has eroded whatever real wage, like the real wage appreciation is so low, it's probably negative only. So what they were
Hmm.
paid in the 90s, after that, there's not been much appreciation in what they are paid. And whereas inflation has, of course, uh, galloped. So that is another aspect of how their life has changed.
Fascinating. Wow. I mean, I really don't know what to say. It's so difficult living in our urban cocoons to like even like comprehend the scale of these problems, let alone like come up with solutions. But rather than like end on that rather somewhat dismal note, I'd like to end on something that I personally like really enjoyed in the book, and that is your descriptions of the mornings across India. There's just something so fascinating there about like where when you have a late night, when you have consumed various intoxicants perfectly legally, mind you, with these truckers, and then you wake up and you're in this different place, and then tell us a little bit about the experience, man. Like what is it like to see India at dawn in so many different places? How did that impact your view of this country?
Man, that was the best part. I think just waking up in the like traveling all night in a vehicle through like these unknown landscapes. You don't even know, it's just pitch black. Often the truck drivers would take the rural roads to evade uh, RTO officials, and these roads were not lit at all. So you had no idea what's around you. And when it's finally morning, when you slept for like 2 3 hours barely, and then when you see the fresh scent of the crops, and it's just like, of course, this might be the city boy like me, romanticizing the bucolic sort of atmosphere of rural India, but it just stays with you, man. Like those are the memories that stayed with. They are still with me. I mean, often most of our life we forget most of the things we experience, right? But these moments of clarity, as I would say, when you see the world in the new light in the morning, these moments of clarity stay with you. And I think that's what we are, right? The memories that we have, that's what we are. So yeah, I would say it's worth it.
Beautiful. On that note, Rajat, we are at the end of our time. Let me just thank you, first of all, for writing this book. I'm going to put a link to the Amazon page in the description. And let me insist once again, if you enjoyed this conversation, please go check out Truck the India. Absolutely fascinating book. You will not think about India the same way after you've read it. Thank you so much, Rajat, for joining me. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. And thank you once again for like really taking the time and effort to like really meet these folks and bring their stories to all of us. You've definitely done Indians and history nerds the world across a really great favor. So Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And also to all of our listeners who are a little surprised to find your favorite Takshashila history nerd back on All Things Policy. You're going to hear from me again very, very soon. I will be doing Friday episodes here and there on All Things Policy, and I will usually be talking about various issues related to India's history and culture with folks that I've happened to come across my journeys as a historian. So I look forward to seeing you all, or I look forward to you guys hearing me in all of those very soon as well. Once again, cheers. Thank you, Rajat, and I will see you very, very soon, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Siet, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and PayPal. We really do appreciate the support. On Cyrus Says, we discussed quite a bit about the local assembly elections this month. Vasanti Hariprakash was there to talk about the West Bengal elections, and then we also spoke to Pradeep Gupta, a psephologist and author. He's the chairman and MD of Access My India. Do definitely check that episode out. Great conversation. Tune into This Round Is On Me, where Gauri Devi Dayal caught up on the latest trends in the PR industry with Archana Jain from PR Pundit. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor spoke to Anandita Chatterjee. She's the founder of Travel Chatter. She's been a marketer with some large firms and has traveled to 67 countries so far. It was a RuPaul Drag Race fan club on KBCD where Farhad and Sunetro discussed the show's best moments and talents. Amber Rana was joined by celebrity fitness trainer Shivoham on Know Your Kanun to discuss fitness laws and regulations in India. They talk about the laws and infrastructure that exist to protect gyms, trainers, and also consumers in the fitness industry. And on the note with Maruk Inayat, we are clinical psychologist and friend of the network, Sonali Gupta. She talks about ongoing mental health issues like survivor's guilt, coping with anxiety around the pandemic, and doom scrolling. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Do you know Tamil? Tamil Puriyuma? Do your children enjoy great stories that inculcate good values? Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran and I host the Storytime Tamil podcast. I am excited to share a short story with great moral values every day. Listen to Storytime Tamil on the IVM podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from.